In 1889, along the Hudson River waterfront in New York, a steam pile driver was pounding timber into the riverbed at 40 blows per minute. The iron ram weighed nearly 5 tons. It rose, fell, and struck with enough force to shake the wooden platform beneath the workers' feet. Then the hoisting cable snapped. The ram dropped free, the timber pile kicked sideways, and 2 men were thrown into the water. One was crushed between the pile and the barge. He died before they could pull him out. The other surfaced screaming, his arm shattered below the elbow. There was no explosion, no fire, just iron, gravity, and a rhythm so relentless it had become invisible. This was the reality of pile driving in the age of steam, a machine that delivered 10,000 pounds of force every few seconds, hour after hour, while men worked close enough to feel the shockwaves in their bones. The hammer rose and fell so constantly that workers stopped flinching. The pounding became background noise. The danger became routine. This is the story of the machines that built the foundations of modern cities, bridges, wharves, railroads, and skyscrapers, while grinding down the bodies of the men who operated them. These were the bone shatterers, and they ran without mercy. Foundations were the problem. Rivers, harbors, marshlands, and soft coastal soil could not support the weight of bridges, wharves, or buildings. Without a way to anchor structures deep into solid ground, cities could not expand. Commerce could not flow. Progress stopped at the water's edge. For thousands of years, builders solved this problem with brute force. Ancient Romans drove wooden piles beneath Venice using teams of men hauling on ropes. Medieval construction crews lifted stone weights by hand and dropped them onto timber posts, pounding them inch by inch into the earth. The work was slow, exhausting, and dangerous. A single pile could take half a day. A bridge foundation might take years. Then steam changed everything. In 1839, Scottish inventor James Nasmyth sketched the first design for a steam-powered hammer. By 1845, he had built a working machine and demonstrated it at the Royal Dockyards in Devonport, England. The results were staggering. A pile that once required 12 hours of manual labor was driven in 4.5 minutes. The math was undeniable. Steam won. I need to pause real quick. If these construction history stories are interesting to you, I would appreciate it if you could subscribe and let me know in the comments what industrial dangers I should investigate next. Now, back to the action. By 1875, Vulcan Iron Works was manufacturing steam pile hammers in the United States. Within a decade, they dominated construction sites across North America. The mechanism was brutally simple. A heavy iron ram, weighing anywhere from 500 to 10,000 pounds, was raised by steam power and dropped onto the head of a wooden or steel pile. Gravity did the rest. But here is where scale became relentless. Single-acting steam hammers delivered 35 to 60 blows per minute. Some double-acting models reached over 100, hour after hour, day after day. The hammer rose and fell with mechanical precision, while men worked close enough to feel each impact in their chests. The machine was efficient beyond anything that had come before, but efficiency came at a cost that would be measured in fractured bones, destroyed hearing, and bodies worn down from the inside out. And as we will soon find out, the men closest to the hammer paid the highest price. The scale of pile driving during the industrial era is difficult to comprehend. When construction began on the Brooklyn Bridge in 1870, engineers faced one of the most ambitious foundation projects ever attempted. Massive wooden caissons had to be sunk to the riverbed, one reaching 44 feet below the water on the Brooklyn side, the other plunging to a staggering 78 feet on the Manhattan side. Pile driving supported the surrounding infrastructure, the approaches, the anchorages. The project consumed 13 years and claimed at least 27 lives. But the Brooklyn Bridge was just one project. Across the country, railroad expansion demanded thousands of wooden trestles. Each trestle required dozens or hundreds of driven piles. Harbor construction along both coasts employed armies of workers pounding timber into soft ground. By the 1880s, pile driving had become one of the defining sounds of American progress. Could you imagine standing on a wooden platform while a 5-ton hammer dropped every second, just feet from where you stood? If you can picture that, let me know in the comments. The typical work environment offered no escape from the machine. Workers stood on platforms or barges positioned directly beside the operating hammer. The surface shook with every blow. Steam hissed from the engine in rhythmic bursts, and the noise was beyond anything most people have ever experienced. Pile driving produces approximately 120 decibels at close range. That is equivalent to standing next to a jet engine during takeoff. Workers had no hearing protection, no vibration dampening beneath their feet, no safety barriers between themselves and the swinging ram or the rising pile. They worked in these conditions for 10 or 12 hours at a stretch. Why did men accept this? Because construction paid better than farm labor or factory work. Because danger was normalized across every industrial job. In the 1880s, 1 in every 35 railroad workers was injured each year. 1 in 117 died on the job. Pile driving was simply part of this brutal landscape. It was not uniquely dangerous. It was typically dangerous. Here is what no one understood at the time. The hammer fell tens of thousands of times per day. Each impact sent vibration through the platform, through the workers' feet, up their spines, into their skulls. The noise assaulted their ears without pause. These invisible forces accumulated silently, hour after hour, shift after shift, year after year. The falling hammer was the obvious danger. Everyone could see it rise and drop. Everyone knew to keep clear. But the real damage was happening in places no one could see, inside the ears, along the spine, within the circulatory system. And by the time workers noticed something was wrong, it was already too late to undo. The pile driver did not kill with one blow. It killed with thousands. 3 invisible forces attacked workers simultaneously, and none of them left marks that anyone could see. Start with noise. Pile driving produces between 100 and 120 decibels at the work site. To put that in perspective, permanent hearing damage begins at 85 decibels. A jackhammer operates around 100. A jet engine at takeoff reaches 140. These workers stood in that assault for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day without any form of hearing protection. According to modern research from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, approximately 25% of noise-exposed construction workers have material hearing impairment. That means hearing loss significant enough to affect daily life. In the 19th century, there was no clinical term for this condition. Workers simply said they were going deaf from the work, and they accepted it. Here is why that matters. Hearing loss was only the beginning. Every time the hammer struck, the platform shook. That vibration traveled through the wooden planks, through the workers' boots, into their feet, up their legs, and into their spines. This is called whole-body vibration, and government studies have found strong associations between this exposure and serious back disorders, herniated discs, degenerative spine conditions, chronic pain that never goes away. But workers who guided the piles or held positioning tools faced something worse. They transmitted vibration directly into their hands and arms. In 1918, occupational physician Alice Hamilton traveled to Bedford, Indiana, to study limestone quarry workers using air hammers. Among 38 stonecutters, 89% reported numbness and discoloration of their fingers. The same condition afflicted pile drivers. It is called hand-arm vibration syndrome. The symptoms are terrifying: tingling that does not stop, numbness that spreads, loss of grip strength, and in severe cases, the fingers turn white as blood vessels are permanently destroyed. Workers called it dead finger. The medical term is vibration white finger. Either way, the damage was irreversible. The cruelest part was the accumulation. Unlike a broken bone or a gash that demanded attention, these injuries built up invisibly. A worker might feel fine after a shift, but wake up with back pain that never faded. His hearing might dim so gradually that he did not notice until he could no longer hear his children speak. Doctors had no diagnostic tools. Workers blamed their aches on getting old. There was no compensation for injuries no one could prove, but vibration and noise were only the slow killers. The hammer itself could end a man's life in an instant, and once something went wrong, there was no time to run. Steam pile drivers operated under immense mechanical stress. The ram weighed thousands of pounds. It cycled continuously, rising and falling 35 to 60 times per minute for hours on end. Cables stretched and frayed under constant load. Steam pressure fluctuated with every stroke. Mechanical governors that controlled the hammer's operation could fail without warning. When something broke, the consequences were immediate. The most common failure was the hoisting cable. Under repeated strain, the fibers weakened invisibly until the moment they snapped. When that happened, the ram dropped free. There was no controlled descent. There was no warning. Just 5 tons of iron falling at the speed of gravity onto whatever stood below. And let me tell you something. When a 5-ton hammer drops without warning, there is nothing between the worker and the impact. But cables were only one point of failure. Piles could kick sideways when struck at an angle, sweeping across the platform and crushing anyone in their path. Steam lines ruptured, scalding workers with superheated vapor. The constant vibration weakened scaffolding and platforms until they collapsed without warning. Workers were struck by swinging piles, falling equipment, debris shaken loose from the rig itself. Why was safety impossible? Because the work environment made it impossible. Workers operated in tight spaces, on barges, on narrow platforms, on scaffolding suspended over water or open ground. There was no room to retreat when something went wrong. The machine cycled so rapidly, one blow every 1 to 2 seconds, that inattention for even a moment could be fatal. There were no safety guards, no emergency stop mechanisms, no protective barriers between the men and the machine. The pace of work discouraged caution. Contractors were paid by progress. Every minute the hammer sat idle cost money. Workers who hesitated or complained were replaced by men who would not. Here is the context that made it all worse. Before 1910, There was no workers' compensation in most American states. An injured worker had to sue his employer and prove negligence in court. This was nearly impossible when companies could argue the worker had been careless. Most injuries went uncompensated. Families of killed workers received nothing. The numbers tell the story. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimated 30,000 workplace fatalities per year in the early 1920s. Before World War I, 75,000 railroad workers alone died on the job. Pile driving was simply one danger among many, and it was rarely tracked separately. Deaths were recorded as isolated incidents. Each one was filed and forgotten. But the real horror was not a single catastrophic failure. It was the accumulation, the steady grinding down of men who survived each shift only to return and do it again tomorrow. And you are about to find out what that looked like over a career. The documented incidents follow a pattern that makes them even harder to read. A hammer detaches from its rigging and fatally strikes a worker standing below. A construction foreman is killed when the hammer drops before the pile is properly positioned, striking the timber sideways and sending it into the man guiding it. A worker standing on the tracks of a pile driver falls without any fall protection and sustains fatal injuries. These were not freak accidents. They were systemic failures happening on project after project because the same dangerous conditions existed everywhere. Could you imagine being the man who had to guide the pile into position while 5 tons of iron dropped toward your hands? Your job was to hold the timber steady, to keep it aligned as the hammer fell. One slip, one miscalculation, one moment when the pile kicked instead of driving straight. That was all it took. Occupational Safety and Health Administration files from modern pile driving operations still document these same failure modes. Inadequate rigging inspections, improper load securing, no clear zones around operating machinery. The technology changed, the dangers persisted. But here is a little secret for you. The men who survived the falling hammer often could not escape what the machine did to them over time. Consider hearing loss. Modern studies show that construction workers exposed to high noise levels average 9 decibels of hearing loss in the 3 to 6 kilohertz frequency range compared to unexposed workers. That is the range where human speech is clearest. These workers could not hear conversations. They could not hear warnings. Historical workers with no protection whatsoever fared far worse. Many were functionally deaf by middle age. Consider the spine. Whole body vibration combined with heavy lifting caused herniated discs, chronic pain, and early disability. The platform shook with every blow, and the shaking never stopped. Many pile drivers could not work past 40. Their backs simply gave out. Consider the hands. Workers lost feeling in their fingers. Grip strength failed. Fine motor control disappeared. Cold weather triggered painful episodes as damaged blood vessels constricted and turned the fingers white. They called it dead finger because that is what it felt like. Flesh that no longer responded. Hands that could no longer hold tools. Could you imagine waking up one morning and realizing you could not feel your children's faces when you touched them? The psychological toll compounded everything else. Constant noise caused fatigue, irritability, and insomnia. Workers described feeling shaky after shifts, unable to settle, unable to sleep. Modern research links chronic noise exposure to stress, anxiety, and depression. In an era with no mental health support, workers simply endured until they could not endure anymore. Picture a veteran pile driver at the end of his career, deaf in one ear, back pain constant, fingers that will not stop tingling. He returns to the platform because he has no other way to feed his family. The hammer rises. The hammer falls. He does not flinch anymore. He can barely feel it. The machine took that from him too. It makes me wonder how many men ended up exactly like that, broken in ways no one could see, standing beside machines that had already hollowed them out. But this was not the worst of it all. The damage did not stay on the construction site. It followed workers home, it shaped their families, and it forced a question no one wanted to answer. The impact extended far beyond the construction site. Disabled pile drivers became burdens on their families in an era when disability meant destitution. A man who could not work could not provide. There was no safety net, no government assistance, no pension waiting at the end of a broken career. Basically, what I'm telling you is the machine kept taking long after the workday ended. Deaf workers could not find other employment. Who would hire a man who could not hear instructions? Men with destroyed backs could not labor in factories or fields. They sat at home while their wives took in washing or their children left school to work. The family paid for what the machine had done. Widows fared even worse. When a pile driver was killed on the job, his family received little or nothing. Before workers' compensation laws, a widow had to prove in court that the employer was negligent. Companies employed lawyers specifically to argue that dead workers had been careless. Most cases never made it to trial. Most families simply absorbed the loss and moved on because there was no other choice. Why did no one connect the pattern? Because there was no centralized tracking of pile driving injuries. Deaths were recorded as isolated incidents in local records. Hearing loss was not considered an injury at all. It was just what happened to men who worked around loud machines. Back problems were blamed on age or poor constitution. The connection between workplace exposure and permanent disability was not formally established for decades. The insurance industry noticed something was wrong. Actuarial tables showed construction workers dying younger and becoming disabled earlier than workers in other trades. Premiums climbed higher for construction projects, but this financial pressure was not enough to change practices on the ground. It was cheaper to pay higher premiums than to redesign equipment or slow down production. Public response was minimal because pile driving happened in places the public never saw. Riverbanks, railroad rights of way, harbor facilities far from city centers. Unlike factory fires or mine explosions that killed dozens at once and made headlines, pile driving casualties accumulated one or two at a time. No single disaster demanded attention. Newspapers occasionally reported dramatic accidents, but they treated each death as an isolated incident. The worker was careless. The equipment malfunctioned. Bad luck. The coverage never connected these scattered deaths into a pattern that demanded systemic change. The slow emergence of occupational medicine offered the first glimmers of understanding. In 1918, Alice Hamilton documented vibration-induced injuries among workers using pneumatic tools. Her research eventually influenced workplace practices, but that influence took decades to reach construction sites and even longer to reach pile driving operations in remote locations. It took generations for anyone to measure what these machines were doing to human bodies, and what they discovered would finally force the industry to change, though not before countless men paid the price that should never have been demanded. The first responses were not about eliminating the danger, they were about managing it. Hearing protection became available. though it would not be mandated for decades. Vibration-dampening materials were developed for platforms and equipment. Safety barriers and fall protection were introduced on some sites. Progress came slowly, one incremental change at a time. But the real transformation came from the machines themselves. Diesel pile hammers emerged in the mid-20th century, operating with different mechanics that changed the nature of the work. Hydraulic hammers followed, offering more controlled operation with reduced shock transmission. Then came the breakthrough that mattered most. Vibratory pile drivers, first developed in the Soviet Union in the 1950s, reduced noise dramatically compared to impact hammers. It is nice to see they finally made some headway, is it not? Modern pile driving looks nothing like what those 19th century workers endured. Operators work from enclosed cabs with sound insulation and climate control. Noise barriers contain the worst of the racket. Vibration monitoring ensures exposure limits are not exceeded. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration now mandates hearing conservation programs when noise levels reach 85 decibels. Workers exposed to 90 decibels or above require specific protections. Modern vibratory pile drivers with proper barriers can operate at 70 decibels at 15 meters. Compare that to the 120 decibels that assaulted workers standing just feet from steam hammers. The difference is the difference between conversation and permanent damage. But adoption was uneven. Large, well-funded projects implemented safety measures first. Smaller operations delayed. Some changed only after accidents forced their hand, not before. The pattern repeated what had happened with every industrial danger before. Money moved faster than concern for workers. Think back to where we started: the Brooklyn Bridge, the railroads, the harbors that connected American commerce. All of them were built on foundations driven by machines that destroyed the men who operated them. The structures remain. Millions of people cross them every day without a thought for what they cost. The hammer still falls today. But now there is distance between the machine and the man. Now there is measurement of what used to be invisible. Now there is accountability where there was only acceptance. The pile driver taught industry a lesson written in damaged bodies and shortened lives. A pile driver is a simple machine. Raise the weight, let it fall, repeat. For a century, that rhythm built the modern world and broke the men who stood beside it. The lesson was paid for in shattered eardrums, destroyed spines, and lives cut short by invisible damage. If force is repeated, it accumulates. If exposure is constant, it compounds. If workers have no protection, they become the cushion between the hammer and the ground. We remember the bridges. We forget who paid for them. The hammer still falls, but now we measure what it costs. Thanks for tuning in.